Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking on a really thought-provoking piece, quite a challenging observation, actually, of a perceived societal shift. And it comes from someone who calls himself a former true believer.
Yeah, it's quite the framing, isn't it?
It is. Our source for this exploration is an essay called The Watcher at the Edge of the Republic by Chris Abraham, published on his Substack.
Yep.
What makes this account so compelling, I think, is the author's really distinct vantage point. He's not writing to stir things up or, to prescribe solutions.
Right. He's very clear about that.
He is. He says he's not trying to burn anything down, not calling for a revolt or secession or even policy. Instead, his goal is just to observe, to simply just watch. He positions himself as a witness to what he describes pretty starkly as a republic that doesn't know it's collapsing.
Wow, that's a heavy statement.
It really is. So our mission in this deep dive is to pull out the most crucial insights from this, deeply personal but also analytical account, to really try and understand the core of his claim and what it might imply for our society.
And it's exactly that perspective, that of a detached, maybe, but still deeply invested observer that gives us so much to talk about.
Yeah.
The author isn't just some academic looking from the outside. He's someone who seems to have navigated pretty significant changes from within different spheres of influence.
Right.
His observations, they aren't just abstract theories. They feel rooted in firsthand experience. And they definitely challenge a lot of assumptions we might have about how these big societal shifts happen. And crucially, maybe what the underlying motivations are for people on different sides of these cultural and political divides we see everywhere. He gives us this lens, really, to view this changing landscape through the eyes of someone who clearly remembers a different time. And that memory, well, it profoundly shapes his conclusions now.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because Abraham dives right into the heart of what he thinks has changed. He starts by looking back, reflecting on an era when certain principles, certain institutions, they felt almost sacrosanct, inviolable.
Like bedrock.
Exactly. And then he contrasts that sharply with today's reality as he sees it. So for him, what was that foundational belief and how does he describe its transformation? He grounds this whole initial point specifically in his own history with the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union.
Okay, the ACLU, that's a significant starting point.
It is. For Chris Abraham, being a card-carrying member of the ACLU, well, it once meant something very specific, almost like an unwavering commitment. It wasn't about politics, he says, or particular ideology. It was, as he describes it, about dedicating yourself to defending principle even over personal revulsion.
That's a powerful idea. Defending something you hate because of principle.
Imagine that, right? Defending someone you might personally find, reprehensible. He uses examples like a Nazi, a pornographer, a dissenter. Not because you agree with them, obviously not, but because the foundational principle of free speech itself, the absolute right to express it, was more important than any personal discomfort or, moral opposition to the message.
So the principle trumped the content.
Precisely. It wasn't about liking what was said. It was about upholding the framework that allowed anyone to speak. That was the core idea for him. And he emphasizes how he personally got involved. He joined the ACLU, he tells us, because Al Gore, prominent political figure, was a member. But he's really quick to clarify why he joined. It wasn't, he insists, about virtue signaling or trying to build some kind of identity.
Yep, not performative.
No. Instead, he saw it as pledging allegiance to the Constitution. Not the performative one, but the dusty one in the glass case.
Ah, that distinction is really telling.
Yeah.
The dusty one.
Isn't it? It points to this perceived shift from seeing the Constitution as this bedrock, enduring document interpreted for its inherent principles to maybe one that, in his view, is now used more selectively, perhaps strategically, maybe even performatively, to gain social points or something.
A tool rather than a foundation.
That seems to be his implication. But then Abraham observes what he sees as this profound and, for him, really disheartening transformation. He looks at the ACLU, the organization he once championed for being impartial, and now he sees it defending rights selectively.
Okay.
He points to the Human Rights Campaign, too, another big institution, which he says now operates like a PR arm of a political faction rather than an unbiased advocate for universal rights.
So losing that perceived neutrality.
That's the idea. And maybe most starkly, he points to what he sees as this dramatic redefinition of core terms, words we all thought had pretty clear, agreed-upon meanings.
Like what?
Well, he notes how free speech, a bedrock principle, is now sometimes actually labeled as violence.
Yeah.
But then, at the same time, silence is also called violence.
So you can't win. Speak or don't speak, it's violence.
Seems that way in his observation. And yet, he notes, with this real sense of irony, that sometimes actual violence gets excused or described simply as just passion.
That's quite an inversion he's describing.
It is. For him, it represents a complete flipping of meaning, a kind of semantic breakdown that makes genuine conversation almost impossible.
One of the most thought-provoking parts of his analysis here is how he connects these institutional shifts not just to what they do, but to the very meaning of the words themselves.
Right, the language.
Exactly. And it raises this incredibly important question, really, for any society that relies on shared understanding. What actually happens when the common language, the very thing that underpins our public discourse, that lets us understand each other, maybe build consensus, what happens when that starts to fracture so fundamentally? When the definitions of basic concepts like freedom or justice or even violence become so different depending on who you ask? I mean, how can any productive conversation, let alone resolution, even start?
It's like speaking different languages while using the same word.
Precisely. This erosion of the semantic bedrock, as Abraham describes it, doesn't just make conversation hard. Arguably, it makes it impossible for different groups to even agree they're talking about the same reality. It sounds a bit like, a societal Tower of Babel, where communication actually fuels more division instead of unity. And to really get the weight of his perspective, I think we need to understand his personal journey through all these changing norms. He's very careful to say, I don't say this as some kind of red-hatted reactionary.
He wants to distance himself from that label.
Definitely. He's actively pushing back against partisan framing. Instead, he describes himself as someone who clearly remembers a different progressive era, a time when even progressives believed in the Bill of Rights.
So his critique isn't coming from an outsider, an ideological opponent.
No, that's the key. It's coming from someone who feels he was once deeply aligned with core principles that have, in his view, just profoundly shifted. It feels like it comes from a place of perceived betrayal, maybe, more than just opposition.
Interesting.
And he reinforces this by talking about his diverse background. Growing up in Hawaii, he says he was surrounded by people who didn't look like me, sound like me, or vote like me, but who were still mine.
That paints a picture of a certain kind of pluralism.
It does. A foundational understanding of shared community, despite deep differences, a quality he feels is maybe missing now. And he also mentions having these significant connections to, traditional power structures, which gives his current observations a lot of weight.
Like what sort of connections?
Well, he mentions having friends in the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, being close with Colonel Frank Burns, the guy who famously coined the Army slogan, "Be all you can be."
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah. And he also talks about having long, insightful conversations with Hope O'Keefe, who he calls a brilliant constitutional lawyer who is now steering the same institutions I can't recognize anymore.
So these aren't just random anecdotes?
Not at all. They demonstrate his deep prior connection, which makes his current sense of disconnect even sharper. His views seem to stem from a real familiarity with these systems, not from ignorance or, some kind of radical opposition. He seems to have watched these changes happen from the inside, or at least very close to the systems he's now critiquing. And this inside perspective also leads to his personal experience of what he calls being algorithmically sidelined.
Algorithmically sidelined? What does that mean?
Well, he tells this sort of darkly funny story about joking he should try to get himself on the Southern Poverty Law Center's watch list and how it stung a little. Not because it was untrue, but because, he says, it probably wasn't. Yeah. He thinks this is because he's been adjacent to too many counter-narratives for too long. He mentions his history, early new media strategies, launching platforms like memes.org and MemeSpace, spelunking down internet rabbit holes that the polite world doesn't like to admit exist.
So exploring the digital fringes.
Right. But he doesn't think he's under active surveillance exactly. Instead, he feels he's been algorithmically sidelined, bozo-filtered, soft shadow banned, passively quarantined from the center of discourse.
Ah, so it's more subtle, like being tuned out by the algorithms that control visibility.
Exactly. It highlights this very modern, subtle, yet maybe pervasive form of exclusion, where the routes to mainstream conversation are just quietly technologically shut down. It's not overt censorship like a ban, but a quiet, almost invisible removal from the public square. A very contemporary way of being silenced, perhaps.
This brings us to a really critical point in his argument, doesn't it? Because Abraham then takes this idea of fractured language and really brings it to a head. He says he's watched the meaning of words collapse. leading to a situation where even the most powerful labels, words that used to carry immense, almost destructive weight, seem to lose their punch, their power. What specific examples does he use to show this semantic erosion? And what does he think the consequences are?
Right, this is central to his thesis.
He starts with the word racist. He recalls its traditional meaning, a term you'd reserve for people who, as he puts it very vividly, engaged in acts like displaying burning crosses.
A really clear, unambiguous image of overt hate.
Exactly. Chilling. But then he looks at how it's applied now. The term, he says, is now applied to him. And he gives this very specific self-description to highlight what he sees as the absurdity of this label being used against him.
What does he say?
He describes himself as a 55-year-old, 6'3", 340-pound, Jesus-believing gun owner with a lifetime NRA membership and an ACLU card in my drawer.
That's quite a combination, NRA and ACLU.
It is, and that detailed self-description is crucial because it paints this picture of someone who, by his own account and his history, especially that ACLU card, seems to completely defy the traditional historical definition of the word now being thrown at him. It's his way of saying, look at who I am, what I've stood for, how can this label possibly fit? It highlights the massive gap he perceives between the word's original meaning and how it's used today.
So the definition has stretched beyond recognition for him.
That's his argument. And the dilution, he says, doesn't stop there. He notes with clear frustration that the term fascist is now casually thrown around to describe parents at school board meetings.
From totalitarian regimes to concerned parents.
Right. A word historically tied to dictatorships, extreme political violence, now used in his observation to describe citizens participating in local democracy. The very casualness of it, for him, strips the word of its actual horror.
It trivializes it.
That's exactly his point. He argues that this widespread, almost indiscriminate use of these really potent labels leads to the spell lose its power. He observes that these labels used to be nuclear, now they're bumper stickers.
That's a striking image. Nuclear to bumper sticker.
Isn't it? A term meant to signify something utterly destructive, abhorrent, like a societal catastrophe, now reduced to just a common, easily dismissed slogan. Something that meant the end of civilization now just signifies, maybe, a disagreement.
And the consequence of that.
Well, as he sees it, it's profound and deeply damaging to any real public conversation. He says, when everything is fascism, nothing is. When everyone is a bigot, no one listens.
So the constant accusation makes people tune out.
He's saying the inflation of these terms, applying them to almost everything, just renders them meaningless and ineffective. They lose their power to genuinely identify and condemn real evils, leaving this vacuum where clear moral judgment used to be. And the ultimate result of all this, for him, is a public square that's fundamentally broken. He states it plainly, almost with finality. The public square is broken, the conversation is poisoned.
Yeah.
And his poignant conclusion on this, I haven't changed, but the rules have. That's his core lament, right? The crux of his personal bewilderment. The very framework for dialogue, for understanding the shared civic space, it's fundamentally shifted under his feet. He feels like he's playing by rules he doesn't recognize anymore, rules he didn't agree to. It's not that he moved, it's that the ground itself changed.
You know, if we connect this to the bigger picture, Abraham isn't just talking about words changing. He's really diagnosing a fundamental breakdown in shared understanding.
Right, which you said earlier is essential.
Absolutely. It's a core element for any society to function. It's not just about political labels losing their sting. It's about the basic ability to communicate, to even find common ground, let alone resolve differences. When your basic vocabulary, your interpretations are so wildly different.
Yeah.
And this leads him to observe this really fascinating and frankly quite unexpected dynamic in how society reacts, particularly how what he broadly terms the left and right have responded to this perceived shift in the rules of the game.
Okay, how does he see those responses playing out?
He uses this really vivid, memorable analogy, the restaurant analogy, to describe what he perceives as the left's victory in the cultural war and what came next.
The restaurant analogy, how does that go?
He says the activist left was invited to the table. Okay, simple enough. But then in his observation, the response was to order everything on the menu. 3 lobsters, 4 steaks, 12 meals to go.
Huh. Okay, quite an appetite.
Right. But here's the kicker. When the check came, they demanded someone else pay.
Ah, so it's not just about ordering a lot.
No. It's Abraham's powerful metaphor for what he sees as this imbalance of demand versus responsibility. He seems to be suggesting this fundamental disconnect where one group pushes for expansive societal changes, for identity affirmation, but expects others to bear the cost, whether that's financial, social, or otherwise. And that, in his view, inherently fuels resentment and disengagement among those who feel left holding the bag.
So an insatiable demand without acknowledging the resources needed.
That seems to be the implication, an appetite for transformation without maybe a corresponding appreciation for the effort, the resources, or the foundational support required to actually sustain it.
Okay, so that's his take on the left's victory. What about the right's response in this analogy or this observation?
Well, in stark contrast to that perceived overreach, he describes the right's response as something quite different. It's a quiet, strategic disengagement. Maybe not what many would expect, given all the heated rhetoric we hear.
Quieter. How so?
He notes, the right didn't scream. They didn't march on cities. Instead, he observed a different, much more subtle strategy. They unplugged, defunded, withdrew.
Unplugged, defunded, withdrew. That sounds less like fighting back and more like opting out.
Exactly. It's not about active rebellion in the traditional sense. It's more like a strategic retreat from what they perceive as a lost cultural battlefield. He even specifically says they didn't try to storm the Capitol, which seems to imply he's distinguishing his observation of their general long-term strategy from specific headline-grabbing events. He's talking about a broader, more pervasive trend of strategic withdrawal.
Can he give examples of this unplugging?
Yeah, he details this process of decentralization with some concrete examples, he says. They stopped sending their kids to your schools. They started homeschooling, building co-ops, decentralizing.
Creating parallel structures.
Precisely. It's a significant, quiet shift. It suggests a deliberate effort to build parallel systems, parallel communities, rather than keep fighting within existing ones that they feel no longer align with their values.
So if you can't win the game, start a new game somewhere else.
That seems to be the idea. And his conclusion on this point is really striking, almost provocative. He says, you won the cultural war, they let you have it, and then they built something else.
Wow. They let you have it.
Yeah. It suggests not a surrender out of defeat, but a strategic, maybe even defiant, retreat to rebuild and reestablish their own values and institutions outside the dominant cultural sphere. It's a profound claim that one side essentially won the main cultural battlefield, but the perceived loser then quietly, perhaps strategically, just walked away and started constructing an entirely new field, a separate reality almost, rather than keep fighting for the original one.
It's a vision of two societies just drifting apart then, not clashing within the same space anymore.
That's what it sounds like he's describing. Less direct conflict, more separation.
This section really does shift the perspective, doesn't it? Moving away from the visible cultural arguments to suggest this deeper, more systemic conflict, one that's way less obvious but maybe more impactful. And he controversially calls it the real civil war.
Yeah, that's a term that definitely gets your attention.
It does. How does he describe the nature of this new kind of conflict? What are its battlegrounds? Because they're clearly not what most people think of when they hear civil war.
No, definitely not. He describes the nature of this conflict as quiet, economic, systemic.
Quiet, economic, systemic.
That's the crucial distinction. It's not about guns and soldiers or traditional battle lines or even direct confrontation in the streets. Instead, it's about the strategic, almost surgical use of financial leverage, bureaucratic processes, logistical choke points.
Financial and logistical leverage.
Exactly. He illustrates this with a really powerful, maybe unsettling metaphor. Red America doesn't want to invade Blue America. It wants to starve it.
Starve it, that sounds grim.
Well, starvation here doesn't seem to mean literal deprivation of food. It seems to refer to the calculated act of cutting off resources, defunding institutions, disrupting the very lifeblood, the funding, the supply chains of systems and organizations that the other side relies on. It's like a war of economic attrition.
Okay, so not military tactics, but economic and bureaucratic ones.
That's right. He details these subtle but potentially potent tactics. Turn off the supply chains, cut the water, defund the grants. These aren't military actions. They're sophisticated economic and bureaucratic maneuvers designed to put pressure on and ultimately maybe defund or diminish the influence of institutions and networks seen as antagonistic.
And he gives an example of this, right, with public media.
Yes, he provides this fascinating, almost insider's perspective on what he calls shadow subsidies, specifically talking about public media like NPR. Yeah. He addresses that common claim from NPR that they only get, what, 2% from the government?
Right, you hear that number a lot.
Yeah. And from his inside knowledge, which likely comes from his background in media and strategic comms, he says, with a bit of a knowing wink, anyone who's been inside knows that's a joke.
Okay, so where does he say the real money comes from?
He then points out how the money actually flows, giving specific examples through CPB, NEH, NEA, USAID.
Right, CPB is Corporation for Public Broadcasting, NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities, NEA Arts, and USAID is International Development.
Exactly. These are the less visible pipelines, right? The network of indirect funding that keeps certain institutions afloat, gives them a kind of financial life support that isn't immediately obvious if you just look at direct government appropriations.
And his insight into weaponizing this funding, it's pretty chilling.
It is. It's chillingly simple and strategic. He says, you want to stop public media, don't censor it. Instead, he says, just stop funding the oxygen tanks.
Wow. Cut off the air supply, not ban the speech?
That's the core insight. It's about cutting off the financial life support, the very air the institution breathes, rather than engaging in direct ideological suppression, which, as he notes later, could look bad, could look tyrannical. It's a quiet chokehold, not a loud ban.
That really does raise important questions about how power works, how conflict can be waged in these deep cultural divides we see. Abraham's analysis, it's not about tanks and bombs, as you said,
No.
but about using financial tools, bureaucratic rules to get results without that overt confrontation. And he applies this same thinking, this strategic systemic approach to universities too, right?
He does. And what he reveals there also says a lot about the differing values and tactics he sees at play.
So how does he see this applying to universities?
Well, he argues you can't just shut down universities directly because, as he puts it, it would look like fascism. That would be too obvious, too politically toxic, probably provoke a huge backlash.
Okay, so direct shutdown is off the table.
Right. But he describes a much more strategic leverage point, one that avoids that direct suppression. He posits. But if you redefine their excesses as anti-Semitism, which many of them are now guilty of, you can cut off federal grants under Title VI.
Ah, Title VI. That's the Civil Rights Act provision about discrimination in federally funded programs.
Exactly. So by linking perceived campus excesses, maybe protests, certain rhetoric, to a legally actionable form of discrimination like anti-Semitism, he identifies this very precise, almost surgical way to defund institutions without appearing to engage in politically motivated censorship. It's a sophisticated legal and financial move using existing laws.
Using the system against itself, in a way.
That seems to be the idea, and he sums up the nature of this quiet war so succinctly, it really encapsulates the whole thing. You don't need tanks. You need accountants and lawyers and parents who won't write another tuition check.
Accountants, lawyers, and parents. The weapons of the quiet war.
It perfectly captures his premise of this economic civil war. It's fought with balance sheets, legal filings, individual financial choices, not bullets. It's a war of attrition, of strategic withdrawal and defunding, not invasion or direct assault. It recognizes where the real power levers might lie in our complex, interconnected society.
And he goes deeper into the ideological divide behind this, right? Talking about what each side holds sacred.
Yes, he does. He observes the left made everything sacred. Gender identity, racial identity, pronouns, dietary choices, even tone of voice. Now, that paints a picture of a very broad, very sensitive range of areas where any perceived misstep can be seen as a fundamental affront, almost like blasphemy.
So a lot of potential tripwire.
Right. For him, this massive expansion of what's considered sacred makes compromise, maybe even civil discussion, incredibly difficult because so many topics become almost untouchable, beyond critique or even just questioning. If almost everything is sacred, then any disagreement risks becoming desecration.
Okay, so that's the left's sacred space in his view. What about the right?
Well, in stark contrast, he says, the right made nothing sacred except autonomy.
Nothing sacred except autonomy. That's a huge difference.
It's a profound distinction, isn't it?
Yeah.
Highlighting this core, almost singular value of self-governance, individual freedom, maybe freedom from interference, above pretty much everything else. And this fundamental difference in what each side considers sacred naturally leads to fundamentally different ways of approaching conflict and resolution.
How so?
Well, if one side sacralizes numerous aspects of identity and expression, demanding affirmation and protection for them, and the other side really only sacralizes individual autonomy, primarily seeking freedom from imposition, then their points of conflict, their very languages of grievance, become fundamentally different. It makes finding common ground, let alone reconciliation, profoundly challenging. They're almost operating in different moral universes.
And he uses a metaphor for this too, right? The rubber band.
Yes, the rubber band metaphor. It's quite compelling. He uses it to illustrate the potential breaking point of this quiet disengagement, the consequences if this dynamic keeps stretching. He says, the right doesn't want control. It wants distance. And if you push hard enough, if you stretch the rubber band too far, it doesn't snap back, it breaks.
It breaks, doesn't snap back.
Right. That implies a point of no return for this disengagement. A permanent separation, maybe, rather than just a temporary tension that might eventually ease up and revert back. It suggests that this desire for distance, for a separate existence, if pushed too far by the actions of the other side, will lead to a complete severing of ties, a fracturing into genuinely distinct societies, perhaps, rather than a return to some shared status quo. It's really a warning of irreparable rupture.
So, given all these really profound observations, shifting principles, eroding language, this new kind of systemic conflict, what does this all mean for Chris Abraham himself, personally? What's his ultimate position in this landscape he's describing? He ends up calling himself, quite pointedly, the Watcher. What does that role actually entail for him?
It feels like a very deliberate choice of identity.
It does. He starts by emphatically rejecting the very labels he says have lost their meaning and are now just weapons. He states, quite plainly, I'm not a racist. I'm not a sexist. I'm not a fascist. I don't think I'm literally Hitler.
Strong denial.
It's very strong, almost exasperated, you feel. They serve to reinforce his self-perception as someone standing outside these ideological boxes, outside the accusations he's been critiquing. He's really trying to make it clear his observations aren't coming from malice or some extreme ideology or just to provoke. He wants to communicate his stance as one of maybe dispassionate observation, not partisan attack.
Trying to establish objectivity, perhaps.
Perhaps. His core statement, the one that really defines where he stands now in all this is, but I am something else. I'm done pretending I don't see what's happening.
So an end to denial or willful blindness?
Exactly. It's not resignation, maybe not despair, but this clear-eyed, almost defiant acknowledgement of a reality he feels many others just aren't willing or maybe aren't able to face. And that stark recognition leads him right to his self-appointed role. Call it what you want. I'm just the Watcher.
Just the Watcher.
His role, as he defines it, is purely observational. He's not stepping in, not fighting for a side, not even really advocating for a particular policy fix. He is simply, as he sees it, bearing witness to a process he believes is unfolding, maybe the end of an era he feels is beyond intervention now. He's the chronicler, not the combatant. And he wraps up his entire observation, his sense of things unraveling, with another really powerful, quite melancholic analogy, that of the restaurant going dark.
The restaurant again.
Yeah, he comes back to it. He paints this vivid, almost cinematic scene for us. I see the restaurant going dark. I see the check unpaid. I see the waiter leaving. I see the lights flicker.
That imagery, it really lands, the collapse of a shared space.
It does. It symbolizes the collapse or maybe the abandonment of a shared public space, a common ground, the restaurant, where people used to gather, talk, interact under some kind of shared rules. It implies a fundamental civic infrastructure just being dismantled piece by piece. The lights are going out.
But there's more to that image, isn't there?
There is. The truly poignant, maybe even heartbreaking part of this imagery is the stark contrast he draws right at the end. He says, and I see the activists yelling at the mirror, still arguing over the pronouns on the dessert menu.
Oof, that's quite the closing image.
Isn't it? It encapsulates his entire view of a societal collapse where the fundamental structures are crumbling, where the very basis of shared life is maybe disappearing. Yet in his perception, some factions remain completely fixated on what he clearly views as trivial or superficial issues, totally oblivious to the larger existential threat, the growing darkness around them. It's this powerful, almost tragic image of completely misaligned priorities, focusing on the minutiae while the whole building is metaphorically burning down.
You know, this is such a profoundly poignant reflection. It's clearly rooted in a deep love for his country, for his community, but it's mixed with this undeniable, almost mournful sense of irreversible change.
Yeah, you really feel that tension.
You do. The author isn't fighting anymore. He's witnessing what he truly believes is the end of an era, a chapter closing. His statement, I love my country, I love my friends, but I also know when a party is over, that just expresses such a deep, abiding affection alongside this harsh, inescapable reality he perceives.
It's like grieving for something while it's still technically there.
Exactly. It's the lament of somebody who still cares deeply, who's still connected, but who has to acknowledge that a certain social and civic chapter has just undeniably, maybe irrevocably closed.
Mm.
It's a quiet grief for what was.
Mm.
And he clarifies his role one last time, really cementing his position as this silent observer.
Mm.
I'm not here to fight. I'm just here to witness, to remember what it used to mean.
Witness and remember.
Yeah. It reiterates his passive yet deeply engaged role. He's not just passively observing, he's actively trying to preserve a memory, an understanding of a past state, maybe for himself, maybe for anyone else who might recognize it later. He seems to be holding a space for a different kind of truth, one rooted in a past understanding of shared principles, hoping perhaps to articulate it for future generations, or for those who might one day look back and wonder how things got to be this way.
And this brings us to his final, deeply provocative thought. The lingering question he leaves us with. It really resonates, doesn't it? Long after you finish reading. It's this haunting echo.
What's the final question?
He asks us to wonder quietly after the last credit card is declined, after the last fund is frozen, if they'll ever realize who was paying the bill the whole time.
Who was paying the bill the whole time?
Yeah. And that's not just about money, is it?
No, I don't think so. It feels much deeper than just financial support. It seems like a broader inquiry into the unseen foundational supports, the silent contributions, the implicit agreements, maybe the shared unacknowledged values that actually underpin that restaurant when it was still brightly lit and bustling.
The things holding it all together unnoticed.
Exactly. He's asking if the activists yelling at the mirror, or maybe any faction caught up in the heat of the cultural moment, will ever truly grasp the hidden sources of stability, the quiet patronage, the foundational elements that sustain the very structures and freedoms they might have once taken for granted. It really leaves you, the listener, to ponder those often invisible hands that built and maintained the very systems now perceived to be fracturing or collapsing all around us.
We've taken a truly deep dive into Chris Abraham's The Watcher at the Edge of the Republic. We've explored this really powerful, deeply personal account of a nation as he sees it, grappling with shifting principles, the profound erosion of language, and this new, quiet, kind of systemic disengagement. It's definitely a perspective that challenges you to look beyond the daily noise, the headlines, the political back and forth, and consider the deeper currents that might be at play.
Absolutely. The author's observations, they really invite us to consider not just what is changing in our society, but how it's changing, and what the long-term implications might actually be for our shared public square, for our foundational institutions. It really makes you think about those hidden levers of power, doesn't it? And the quiet, almost invisible strategies that might be unfolding just beneath the surface of the daily news cycle.
Yeah.
It's a powerful reminder, I think, that not all conflicts are fought with traditional weapons, and that fundamental shifts can happen without those overt dramatic confrontations we might expect.
So as we close out this deep dive, maybe consider the author's final haunting question. If the party is indeed over, as he suggests, and the lights are flickering, will the different factions ever truly understand who is paying the bill the whole time? It's a thought that certainly leaves you with a lot to chew on. It invites us all, maybe, to reflect on the unseen foundations of our own society and the potential consequences when, or if, they're taken for granted.